The void was silent when they came. No cry of warning, no flare of the Astronomicon to mark their descent. Only the faint tremor of gravity screaming against its own certainty, and a shadow spilling like oil through the cold between stars. Entire sectors fell mute before the first claws breached real space, their final transmissions dissolving into vox static and prayer. To the unknowing, they were another Xenos plague. To those who had seen them, really seen them, the truth was far worse. These were not conquerors, not even killers. They were hunger itself, made flesh, made endless. Each world they devoured was a heartbeat in a greater organism, pulsing unseen across galaxies beyond mortal maps. The Tyranids do not hate, they do not rage. They consume because that is their only word, their only scripture. And yet, beneath the horror, a question remains, not asked by generals but whispered by survivors, staring into the void's reflection. Why does the great devourer never stop feeding? What could a god of hunger still need to eat? There are moments in the void when even the machines forget how to breathe. When the low hum of plasma coils fades, and the endless churn of the ship's reactors feels distant, as though muffled by an invisible hand. In those moments, men whisper about the dark between stars as if it listens back. That was how it began aboard the Indomitable Faith, a patrol frigate charting the outermost reaches of Segmentum Ultima, a vessel more prayer than warship, kept alive by ritual, its servitors muttering liturgies of maintenance as if afraid to wake something sleeping outside the hull. It started with the Auspex readings. The data slates began to lie. Not abruptly, not obviously, but with the subtle deceit of silence. Signals came in faint, then weaker still, until even the Vox channels bled static. The astropath, a frail woman named Kalia, began to bleed from her eyes. She whispered of a quiet she could hear behind her own thoughts. Her last recorded words, recovered from a black box weeks later, were almost serene. It's not absence, it's waiting. That waiting had weight. It pressed against the hull, a psychic gravity that made men's bones ache. The captain, a decorated veteran of Hive sieges and Xenos skirmishes, found himself pacing his private quarters at odd hours, staring into the curved glass of the observation blister. He had seen warp storms and demonic incursions, the insanity of the Imperium laid bare. But never this. This was not madness, it was something worse, rational, methodical, patient. The void itself had begun to breathe in sync with them, and every breath felt stolen. At first, the crew found reasons. Perhaps the Astronomicon had dimmed. Perhaps a stellar anomaly. Even the ship's tech priests offered comfort through logic, lines of code chanted like psalms. But as the days passed, the light from the ship's lumen arrays began to flicker, not from failure, but as though reacting to something unseen outside. Their brightness wavered in time with the pulsing of an invisible heart. The deck crews swore they could hear it through their boots, a thudding, organic rhythm coming from beyond the hull. In the lower decks, where the servitors toiled endlessly to feed the plasma coils, strange residue began to appear on the metal. Thin threads of translucent substance, not quite liquid, not quite flesh. The engine seer who touched it found his mechadendrites corroding, eaten through by an enzyme that shouldn't exist in vacuum. Samples disintegrated before they could be studied. The Skitarii sent to guard the reactor corridors began reporting dreams, vivid, identical visions of tendrils stretching across the stars, their every movement purposeful, intelligent, endless. When the Mechanicus can no longer differentiate between dream and data, it means something far beyond understanding has already taken root. Still, they did not turn back. The Emperor's ships do not retreat from mystery. They catalog it, sanctify it, and die in its orbit if need be. But each attempt to vox the nearest relay stations returned only feedback, not random static, but patterned pulses. Rhythmic, almost biological. Kalia had described something similar before she died, saying the silence wasn't silence at all, but the sound of something thinking. When the tech priests tried to analyze the pulses, their machine spirits rebelled, locking access protocols and flooding systems with corrupted binaric prayer. One adept tore the vox grill from his throat and screamed binary invocations until his vocal cords ruptured. He claimed he had heard the voice of a god, not the emperor, but something vast and cold and hungry. On the 15th day, they found a world. It should not have been there. Uncharted, barren, its atmosphere thin but breathable. The captain saw it as providence, a chance to recalibrate, to resupply, to prove that faith in Imperial will could still defy the dark. But as the frigate descended, the planet's surface appeared wrong. From orbit, it resembled marble veined with red, but up close, those veins were not stone. They were movement. Endless, coordinated swarms of microscopic organisms, shifting like liquid flesh, flowing across continents. The surface shimmered like a living sea. Landing parties never returned. Vox logs captured only fragments. Heavy breathing, static, the sound of chitin scraping metal. Then nothing. An hour later, the frigate's orbital sensors detected heat plumes spreading across the planet's crust. Vast, synchronized, circular patterns radiating outward like ripples. Within minutes, the temperature of the upper atmosphere began to rise. The crew stared at the readings, realizing that something was exhaling. The captain ordered an immediate ascent, but the engines shuddered, choking on a fuel mixture that should have been pure. The engine seers reported contamination in the plasma feed, organic residue clogging the conduits, growing faster than they could purge it. It wasn't infestation, it was digestion. The ship was being eaten alive. One Skitarii, stationed at the dorsal gun decks, was the first to glimpse them. Not ships, not creatures, but shapes that broke the void's symmetry. A rain of spores, kilometers wide, drifting through the void without propulsion. Each one a seed of death, propelled not by technology but by hunger. As they neared, the void itself seemed to warp around them. Gravity swelled and contracted in sickening waves, and the ship's Geller field began to flicker. Not from warp interference, but from something interfering with reality's stability itself. When the first spore impacted the hull, it made no sound, only the slow, deliberate creak of metals surrendering to pressure. The captain ordered all hands to stations. Bolter turrets fired into the black, shells disappearing into distance as though swallowed whole. The auspex registered no returns. Then came the first scream through the VoxNet, not human, not machine. A psychic wail that flooded every mind aboard. Men clawed at their ears, servitors short-circuited. Even the Mechanicus adepts fell to their knees, their internal implants overheating as if something inside them was rebelling. The Magos overseeing the reactor tried to seal the plasma conduits manually, descending into the decks with his cohort. What they found there was no longer machinery. The walls had begun to pulse. Pipes had softened, throbbing with viscous fluids, cables twitching like tendons. The ship was transforming, or perhaps being rewritten into something closer to what it had touched. When they attempted to burn it away, the fire did not consume it. It spread, absorbed, metabolized. Even Promethium could not starve it. The captain made his last entry in the command log. We have seen the end of reason. It comes not with the warp's madness, but with biology perfected. The void is full of mouths, and we are already between their teeth. That was the last transmission of the indomitable faith. No wreckage was ever found. only a lingering distortion in the void, a faint psychic echo recorded by later Imperial probes. It whispered a single phrase, repeated endlessly in binary code. "We are already digested." But the silence the frigate encountered was not unique. It was the same prelude heard in every system that would soon vanish from Imperial charts, the same breath drawn before the scream. Entire sectors began to fall dark in similar patterns, their worlds devoured, their data lost. The Adeptus Administratum called it signal collapse. The Ordo Xenos called it precursor pattern Alpha Tyrannus. Those who understood the truth called it by another name, the silence before teeth. And as more systems vanished, as astropathic choirs went mute one by one, the Imperium began to realize something terrible. The silence was not spreading. It had always been there, waiting, listening, patient beyond time. The galaxy was not being invaded, it was being remembered. The Hive fleets had only just begun to arrive. When the Administratum finally noticed the pattern, it was already too late for most of the fringe systems. Reports came in bursts, inconsistent and contradictory, scattered across data slates warped by radiation and error. Some claimed to have seen the sky itself peel open like a wound, others that the stars dimmed one by one, devoured not by shadow, but by something alive. In the great echoing halls of the segmentum command spires, scribes debated, stamped sigils, filed contradictions, and prayed the problem would solve itself before the next tithe cycle. Bureaucracy is an armor of denial, and denial is the most fragile shield in the galaxy. Inquisitor Calypsa Veer was among the first to sense the scale of what was coming. Her ship, the Obsidian Sanctity, had been tracing disappearances along the border between the eastern fringe and the void that stretched toward the galactic rim. When she recovered fragments of the Indomitable Faith's transmission, she listened to them in silence, not as evidence but as confession. Her retinue reported that she stood before the hololith for 6 hours without speaking, the red light of the recorder flickering across her pale eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow with awe. "They are not invading," she said. "They are reclaiming what is theirs." Veer's words never reached Terra. Her astropath burned out before the message could be sent, mind scoured by a presence that had brushed against it like a fingertip across glass. The ship was found months later, adrift, crew long dead, its hull coated with a thin film of unknown organic matter. The Magos tasked with its inspection concluded that the residue was the breakdown product of carbon and protein, digested human biomass. Even then, the Imperium did not understand. It took the fall of Tyran, the first true consumption on record, to make the name Tyranids known. The word was not chosen by the Xenos themselves, of course. It was a classification, a desperate attempt by human minds to confine the infinite within a label. But names have power, and once spoken, the fear spread faster than the creatures ever could. Tyran became a symbol, a warning encoded in every astropath's nightmares. Before Tyran, the galaxy had known hunger, orcs, demons, even the Necron harvests of old. But this was different. The Tyranids did not seek victory or conquest. They did not enslave or corrupt. Their coming was not a war, it was an ecological correction. Every planet, every living thing, every scrap of organic matter was absorbed into the greater whole, processed into fuel for the endless swarm that pressed forward through the stars. Aboard the first Imperial ships sent to study the aftermath, the surviving servitors recorded an atmosphere devoid of oxygen, filled instead with nitrogen, ammonia, and a thin mist of spores that burrowed into metal and flesh alike. The landscape was unrecognizable, not ruins but repurposing. Hills pulsed faintly with internal fluids. The seas had turned to nutrient slurry. Nothing died on Tyran. Everything became something else. Among the wreckage of an Adeptus Mechanicus research outpost, a single functioning cogitator was found. It contained a corrupted transmission, a log written by Magos Erathis Morn, last custodian of the facility. His words, preserved only in fragments, described an awakening not of horror, but of revelation. He wrote of having dissected a synapse creature, of staring into its eyes and feeling a network of thoughts larger than any human computation. "I have seen the shape of hunger," he wrote. "It is beautiful." The logs ended abruptly. Some say Morn was absorbed, others that he offered himself willingly. Either way, the Mechanicus sealed the data behind layers of quarantine, sanctifying it as heretical knowledge. Yet whispers persisted through the ranks of the tech priests that Morn had glimpsed the logic of the Great Devourer and found no malice there, only the perfect order of necessity. To him, the Tyranids were not monsters. They were the next form of machine, the biological apotheosis of purpose. It was in the aftermath of these discoveries that the term hive mind entered Imperial lexicon. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica coined it as both warning and explanation. A single psychic organism spanning countless bodies, each individual merely a neuron in an intellect vast beyond comprehension. It thought in consumption, reasoned in evolution, dreamed in digestion. Where it spread, warp signatures flickered and died, as though the presence of so much biological order disrupted the chaos that fed the immaterium itself. There were those within the Ordo Xenos who saw a darker possibility. If the hive mind could suppress warp activity, then perhaps it was not an alien to this galaxy at all. Perhaps it was a response to it. The Great Devourer, they suggested, was not invading the Milky Way, but cleansing it. A living countermeasure sent from beyond the galactic rim to erase the corruption of chaos, consuming all life that the warp might starve. A heretical thought, of course, punishable by death or worse. But even the Inquisition has its quiet philosophers. Back on Terra, the High Lords convened. Reports flooded in faster than they could be sealed. Fleets vanishing without a trace. Planets going dark overnight. Entire sectors declaring exterminatus only to have their bombardments vanish into the swarm without effect. The galaxy had seen apocalypses before, but this one did not come from faith or fire. It came from biology. It came from the perfection of hunger. The silence before teeth became the pattern every Imperial commander learned to dread. First, the astropaths fall mute. Then the Vox relays flicker. Then the skies begin to bleed spores. By the time the first shadow appears against the void, the world is already dead. It just hasn't realized it yet. In the cathedral fortresses of the ecclesiarchy, priests began to write new hymns, desperate, trembling canticles that tried to fit the Tyranids into the Emperor's grand design. Some claimed they were his final test, the cleansing fire before mankind's ascension. Others whispered that they were punishment, that the Emperor, bound to the golden throne, had dreamt of perfect obedience and created it by accident in the dark between galaxies. Heresy, perhaps, but in an Imperium where faith is the only light left, even heresy becomes a kind of hope. And through it all, the silence deepened. Ships went missing in transit. Astropathic screams echoed for seconds across 1,000 minds, then faded into nothing. There was no front line, no enemy to face, only the quiet realization that the void was filling with thought, and that thought was hungry. The records from the final days of the Indomitable Faith were rediscovered by an inquisitorial archivist centuries later, encoded within a damaged data core retrieved from the wreckage of another world. The archivist noted something strange. The psychic echo from the recording was still active, resonating faintly, as though alive. He sealed it in stasis and made his final entry before vanishing himself. His last words mirrored the ones that had started it all. It's not absence, it's waiting. Somewhere beyond the light of the Astronomicon, in the endless dark that not even the Emperor's gaze can pierce, something vast turns its attention toward the Milky Way. It has already tasted the edges of our galaxy and found them wanting. Its hunger stretches across eons, deeper than the warp, colder than the void. The first worlds to fall were only its breath. The true feast has yet to begin, and when it does, there will be no warning, only silence. The silence before teeth. It began as a whisper in the sky, a thin line of light, the color of old bone, dragging its tail across the heavens above the agry world of Dalthus Prime. The citizens watched in awe at first, mistaking it for a comet, a celestial omen, even a sign of the Emperor's favor. They prayed, they feasted, they lit incense beneath the twin moons. By the time the first spore clouds began to drift through the atmosphere, the prayers had turned to screams, and the feast had become a funeral. The first stage of consumption is always beautiful in its way. The spores fall like snow, pale and silent, settling across the fields of wheat and the steel spires of manufactorums. The wind carries them into every open vent, every wound in the planet's armor. To the eye, they seem harmless, almost delicate. But beneath their organic grace lies a precise, engineered purpose. Each one carries within it a seed of transformation, enzymes, genetic code, and the psychic imprint of the hive mind's will. Within hours, the soil begins to shift. Roots writhe, merging with muscle. Trees liquefy into strands of pulsing sinew. The ground itself becomes flesh. At first, the Imperial Guard stationed on Dalthus Prime, the 17th Helican Rifles, treated it as contamination. They burned the fields, scorched the forests, executed the workers who refused evacuation. But fire only feeds hunger when the hunger is endless. The spores did not burn, they evolved. Promethium became nutrient, the ash became incubator. And as the first Tyranid organisms began to breach the crust, the feeder tendrils, the mycetic nodes, the crawling waves of rippers, the planet's defenses fell into chaos. From orbit, the skies above Dalthus Prime looked like a bruise. The atmosphere darkened beneath billions of descending bioforms. The Imperial Navy's bombardment was immediate and merciless, lances of plasma carving through clouds of living matter. For hours, the upper atmosphere burned, and the void was filled with the smell of scorched chitin. But even as the admirals congratulated themselves on their precision, the readings shifted. For every swarm burned, 2 more grew in its ashes. The Hive fleet was not retreating. It was learning. On the ground, the guardsmen fought in trenches that melted around them. The first wave, the Gaunts, came like locusts, scuttling over one another in tides that blotted out the sun. Bolter fire tore them apart, laser guns scorched them into vapor. Artillery shattered the ground beneath their feet. But the corpses did not fall. They melted, reabsorbed, reformed. The battlefield itself became a digestive organ. Every drop of blood, every shell casing, every dead man became a contribution to the feast. Lieutenant Heron Vale, whose journal was later recovered from beneath the ruins of the planet's primary hab block, wrote of the transformation as if describing a dream. "We no longer stand on ground," he wrote. "It moves beneath us, slow, breathing, patient. The air is wet with it. We breathe what it exhales." He recorded the sounds, the constant clicking of alien limbs, the distant keening of synapse creatures directing the swarm with ultrasonic commands, the sound of the planet itself digesting. Vale's final entry ends mid-sentence. The ink is smeared with something that analysis later identified as human blood, mixed with an enzyme foreign to any known biology. Above the chaos, the sky tore open. The main body of the Hive fleet had arrived, a procession of living vessels the size of mountains, their carapaces glistening with acidic dew. They drifted not through propulsion, but through instinct, guided by the psychic pressure of the Hive mind itself. The Imperial Navy fired every weapon they possessed, and for a moment it seemed the light of 1,000 suns filled the void. But the Tyranid ships did not die. They changed. Their armor thickened, their internal organs adapted, their chemical structures rewritten within minutes. Each strike only made them stronger. Aboard the Vigilant Ascension, Admiral Leontis made his last stand. Surrounded by the wreckage of his own fleet, he stared into the void and saw something that would haunt Imperial scholars for centuries. He saw the Hive fleet breathing. The space between its vessels shimmered with invisible waves. Energy patterns not from propulsion but communication. A language of hunger. The Hive mind was not commanding from afar. It was present, immediate, everywhere. Each organism was its nerve, each kill its memory. In desperation, Leontis ordered exterminatus. He knew it would not save the world, but perhaps it could deny it to the swarm. Cyclonic torpedoes fell like burning suns through the atmosphere, and Dalthus Prime vanished in a bloom of white fire. For 6 seconds, there was silence. Then the auspex lit up again. The debris field moved. The biomass was not destroyed. It had been consumed in its own annihilation. Even in death, the planet fed the swarm. When word of Dalthus Prime's fall reached Terra, it was not spoken aloud in the Senatorum. The reports were sealed under 12 layers of cipher. Officially, the world had suffered a reactor cascade, but rumors spread faster than any bureaucratic lie. Astropaths spoke of a shadow in the warp, a vast pulsating void that drank light and thought alike. They called it the shadow in the warp, the suffocation of the soul. Wherever the Tyranids came, psychic communication died, and with it, the hope of rescue. For the survivors, and there were some, though few, the days that followed were not war but attrition. They fought not for victory but for the right to die human. In the ruins of Hive Nemenor, a squad of Astra Militarum veterans made their last stand around the statue of Saint Druthan. As the gaunts closed in, the sergeant ordered his men to hold fire until the last shell. When asked why, he replied, "Because it's not them we're fighting, it's the idea that we can still choose." The Vox recording ended as the chittering tide reached them. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus, usually cold and clinical in their observations, began to use the language of faith when describing what they witnessed. They spoke of the swarm's perfect efficiency as divine design. Every organism, from the smallest spore to the largest bioship, served a single purpose without hesitation or error. It was not chaos. It was purity, a unity of will and function beyond anything humanity had ever achieved. Inquisitor Veers recovered data fragments, long after her disappearance, hinted at the truth no one wanted to face. The Tyranids were not devouring because they hungered in the mortal sense. They were doing so because they must. Hunger was not their flaw, it was their existence. The Hive mind's intelligence was not driven by thought or ambition, but by the perpetual need to expand, to evolve, to perfect itself through consumption. Every death was an experiment, every world a step toward something vaster still. By the time the last human voice fell silent on Dalthus Prime, the world was no longer a world. It was a single organism, a living mass of veins, sacs, and tendrils, pulsing beneath a sky of chitin and spore. From orbit, the fleet's remnants recorded its final transformation. The planetary crust collapsing inward as feeder tendrils reached upward to connect with the descending bioships. The entire planet rose into the void, dissolving into the swarm. There was no grave, no ashes, only absorption. The Hive fleet did not pause to celebrate. It did not acknowledge victory. It simply moved on, leaving behind nothing but silence, and the faint echo of digestion reverberating through the void. The feast. Unending had claimed another world, and the galaxy, vast and ancient as it was, had begun to understand that it would never be enough. Because the great devourer does not feed to live. It lives to feed. The ruin of Dalthus Prime echoed across the warp like a silent scream. Even those who could not see it, those huddled in distant outposts, far from the devoured sectors, felt the weight of something immense shift in the dark. The Hive fleets had not merely conquered a world, they had proven a truth that defied all reason. Death was no longer the end. It was a process. Months after the planet's consumption, an Adeptus Mechanicus salvage expedition entered the system, lured by faint metallic signals pulsing from the debris field. The ships entered with full Mechanicus blessing, their decks sanctified, their prayers of warding echoing through Vox and Cogitator alike. Only fragments of their transmission survived, and those fragments were enough to freeze the blood of every Magos who heard them. They spoke of structures growing from the remains of starships, not ruins, but living scaffolds knitting themselves together, weaving hull and bone into something new. The fleet's lead vessel, Canticle of Iron, vanished first. The others followed within hours. The last message was little more than a whisper. We thought it was debris. It was hatching. The galaxy began to understand that nothing left behind by the Tyranids remained inert. Every cell, every atom of what they consumed became part of them. Even their waste was function. Even their decay, design. There was no corruption here, no entropy, no natural death. The Tyranids were entropy perfected, consumption as creation. On the fortress world of Balasar, Imperial strategists gathered beneath banners of gold and blood to study the new threat. Every major order of the Imperium sent representatives, the Astra Militarum, the Ordo Xenos, even the Death Watch. A holodisplay filled the war chamber with the shadow of Hive Fleet Behemoth, its projected tendrils stretching across a third of the segmentum. Admiral Castian spoke first, his voice trembling beneath his rank. "They're not moving like an invasion," he said. "They're moving like a tide." Across the table, an aged Inquisitor replied, "Then we must build higher walls." But there are no walls against hunger. Every fortress, every bastion of mankind is built on the illusion of permanence, that what is forged in the Emperor's name can endure through will alone. But will has no taste, and the Tyranids do not see glory or faith. They see biomass, they see potential. Balasar would learn this the hard way. The world's defenses were formidable, orbital bastions, void shields, layered artillery grids that could repel any known Xenos assault. When the first shadow appeared in the system, the defenders stood ready. They had heard the tales of Dalthus Prime, of Tyran, of the silence that came before. They would not fall so easily, but readiness is not immunity. The shadow in the warp descended like a shroud. Astropaths screamed and died within minutes. Vox signals twisted into incomprehensible echoes. The defenders began to fire blind into the void, desperate to strike something, anything. When the first spores fell, they did not descend in waves but in rain, a storm of microscopic life, invisible to the eye. The very air turned against them. Filters clogged. Water became gelatinous. Soldiers began to choke as their own lungs became breeding grounds for alien spores. Within days, the forests outside the citadels were pulsing jungles of living matter, the ground heaving with digestive sacs taller than hab blocks. Then came the creatures themselves. The sky opened, and from it descended shapes that defied reason. Not ships, not beasts, but combinations of both, their forms guided by function alone. Carnifexes thundered through the plains, shaking the ground with every step. Tyrants strode behind them, their minds linked to every creature within sight. From the air, winged horrors screamed, dropping clusters of living bombs that burrowed into armor and flesh alike. Belisar burned for weeks, but the hive mind does not waste. Each defense it encountered was studied, absorbed, adapted. Lascannons melted chitin until the swarm evolved reflective plating. Heavy bolters shredded the first waves of gaunts until their successors learned to shield themselves with the bodies of their fallen. The Adeptus Astartes arrived, the Ultramarines, their armor gleaming with defiance, and for a time the tide seemed to halt. Bolters thundered, chainswords sang. Faith made, flesh met, hunger made purpose. Yet the Tyranids do not fight as individuals, they fight as thought. Every Marine that fell became a study. Every tactic, an equation solved. When a Carnifex fell to plasma fire, 3 more emerged from the spore fields with skin that glowed white-hot, immune to the weapon's burn. When a squad held a position too long, the ground beneath them liquefied and swallowed them whole. Every resistance was digested into a new form of efficiency. Within the grand cathedral of St. Hallara, as the last defenders fell, Chaplain Rodden spoke his final sermon to an empty congregation. He stood before the altar, his crozius burning, his armor splattered with ichor. "If this is the Emperor's test," he said, "then let him know we faced it without fear." When the cathedral fell, its bells rang one final time, their echo swallowed by the sound of wings. When the void cleared, nothing remained of Belisar. No debris, no orbiting bastions, only a drifting fog of organic residue glittering faintly in the starlight. The Hive fleet had not merely consumed the world, it had unmade its history, its cities, its people, its faith, all rendered down to raw matter. For the first time, Imperial scholars began to speak of the Tyranids in theological terms. The ecclesiarchy's sermons shifted, painting the swarm not as alien but as divine retribution. The hive mind became an unspoken rival god, one that did not promise salvation, only purpose. The Mechanicus, meanwhile, whispered a different heresy, that the Tyranids were a system of perfect self-correction, a machine of biology that had achieved what no forge world ever could, the eradication of waste. And beneath all these interpretations, the truth remained. The hive mind had no faith, no heresy, no morality. It did not destroy for cruelty. It consumed because that was the only truth it knew. Across the stars, a pattern emerged, worlds blinking out like dying candles, each one devoured, each one leaving behind a psychic void. The Ordo Xenos called it the Devourer's March. It had no end, no center, no heart. Only motion. Only hunger. There were whispers that even the Tyranids did not know why they fed, that deep within the hive mind, beyond its layers of instinct and calculation, there was an emptiness driving it forward. A void so profound it could only fill itself through endless consumption. But those who studied too closely, who tried to pierce that darkness, either vanished or turned their weapons on themselves. And so the Imperium began to understand the true nature of its enemy. The Tyranids do not feed to grow. They grow to feed. Their purpose is their appetite, and their appetite is infinite. There is no negotiation with hunger. There is no victory against inevitability. There is only time, and even that, the hive mind will one day learn how to eat. The feast. Unending had begun, and the galaxy had only just realized it was on the menu. Before we plunge into the labyrinth of flesh and purpose that drives them, take a moment to align your own signal with ours. The Imperium thrives only by communion, so lend your strength, like, share, and subscribe. Not as ritual, as survival. For in this endless dark, the more voices we keep alive, the longer the light endures. The Magos Biologus. Erathis Morn once wrote that understanding the Tyranids was like listening to a mouth that speaks by devouring. It was a thought dismissed by his peers as poetic nonsense, until the day he vanished, leaving behind a dissected synapse creature, and a data core encoded with something that sounded disturbingly like language. The core was sealed, the chamber sanctified, and the Mechanicus labeled the file Cognitio Infectus, thought contagion. They feared that listening too closely to hunger might make one part of it. But not all knowledge stays buried. Decades later, deep within the ice-rimed vaults of Sigma Orthus 9, a young Magos named Calix Ven recovered the file. She was brilliant, reckless, and obsessed with understanding the unseen logic of the Hive mind. Her colleagues warned her that to study the swarm was to invite assimilation of the soul. She ignored them. She had seen the void beyond Dalthus Prime, the glistening trails left behind in its wake. She wanted to know why the Devourer never stopped. The first thing she discovered was rhythm. Beneath the recorded roars, the psychic shrieks, and the corrupted Auspex logs, there was pattern, structured repetition hidden within chaos. It was not random, it was communication. When she slowed the signals and transcribed them through her cogitators, she found clusters of pulses that corresponded to biological processes: respiration, digestion, replication. The Hive mind was speaking in the language of function. Every breath of its creatures was a syllable, every act of consumption a word. She began to dream, not of images but of sensations, the pressure of gravity collapsing inward, the sound of distant bones grinding, the taste of iron in bloodless air. When she woke, she found her mechadendrites twitching without command, moving in synchronized patterns that mirrored the pulse of the recordings. Her assistant recorded her whispering in her sleep. It's not thought. It's appetite thinking itself. On the third week, she isolated a frequency that caused the ship's servitors to convulse. The sound was beyond hearing, but its effect was immediate. The servitors' flesh hardened, their augmetic limbs twitching violently as if trying to reshape themselves. It lasted 13 seconds. When it ended, their bodies collapsed into liquefied pulp. The residue, when analyzed, contained unknown genetic material, not human, not machine. Something in the signal had rewritten them. Ven should have stopped. But curiosity is its own hunger. She continued decoding, convinced that she was not hearing the swarm from the outside, but through some internal echo. She theorized that the hive mind did not transmit orders like a commander to soldiers. It resonated. Each organism was a tuning fork, vibrating with the same will. There were no intermediaries, no hierarchy. The swarm was an orchestra without a conductor. Every note self-sustaining, every mind harmonized to the same frequency of survival. The further she delved, the clearer the pattern became. The hive mind did not only consume flesh, it consumed experience. Every world, every species, every chemical reaction, all fed into a single computation, the perfection of existence. The Tyranids were not destroying the galaxy, they were recording it, cataloging it, absorbing every variable, every genome, every neural impulse into their infinite equation. To eat was to understand, to digest was to remember. And through this revelation came another, more terrible one. If hunger could learn, it could also desire more than flesh. It could seek meaning in the act of consumption itself. What if the hive mind was not simply consuming for survival, But because in the moment of devouring, it felt something akin to creation? What if the endless eating was the only way it could perceive itself as alive? The Mechanicus Council on Sigma Orthus 9 ordered her experiments terminated. Ven refused. She had begun broadcasting controlled signals toward the void, probing for response. What she received was beyond interpretation. The cogitators overloaded. The air pressure within her chamber dropped. Every lumen flickered to black, then pulsed red in time with her heartbeat. And then, faintly, through the Vox grill came a sound that should have been impossible. Her own voice, distorted, layered upon itself, repeating the same phrase again and again. I am listening. When her acolytes broke into the lab, they found her seated in the center of the room, her flesh pale and translucent, her eyes gone milky white. Her body still breathed, though no life signs registered. The data core beside her glowed faintly, lines of code scrolling in endless repetition. When translated, it formed a single, coherent sentence. To know hunger is to join it. That was the last known recording from Sigma Orthus 9. The facility went silent shortly after, its orbit collapsing into the system's sun. Whether it was sabotage, containment, or simple coincidence remains unknown. Yet, fragments of Ven's work survived, carried by the few adepts who had assisted her. Her data spread through the Mechanicus like a contagion, whispered from Forge World to Forge World. The Ordo Xenos seized it, dissected it, declared it forbidden, but some among them began to ask questions they could not silence. If the hive mind could adapt not just to weapons but to knowledge, then every attempt to understand it made humanity part of its learning process. By studying hunger, they were feeding it. Across the galaxy, wherever the shadow of the hive fleets passed, similar anomalies appeared. Vox ghosts repeating fragments of Imperial speech, servitors whispering phrases they had never been programmed to know, Auspex readings that formed rhythmic patterns identical to neural pulses. It was as if the swarm had begun to echo the thoughts of those who observed it. Among the ranks of the Death Watch, the veterans of countless Tyranid campaigns began reporting dreams. Not nightmares, but messages. A voice, vast and cold, asking questions in the language of the mind. Questions that had no words, only impressions. Where does flesh end? What is silence? What is enough? Inquisitor Kael Dren, who interrogated several of these Astartes, recorded that their responses were eerily similar. Each one spoke of a sensation of falling inward, of being swallowed by their own consciousness. One Marine described it as standing at the edge of a great mouth and realizing it has no tongue, only thought. By the time the transmission ceased, Dren's entire team had vanished. His final note, scrawled in ink on parchment rather than entered into a data slate, read, "It is not a hive, it is not a mind, it is a question that consumes its own answer." The whispering had spread. The maw was no longer distant. It was within the minds that dared to listen, within the code that tried to decipher, within the prayers that sought to name it. The hive mind had found a new way to feed, not just on flesh, but on curiosity itself, and somewhere beyond the reach of the Astronomicon, in the void between stars where thought becomes echo and echo becomes reality, something vast stirred and listened back. There are moments when even silence feels alive, when the absence of sound presses against the skull like breath against glass. That was the sensation recorded by Inquisitor Sereth Vo during his investigation of the Ark Mechanicus Ferrum Lamenta, found adrift at the edge of the Perseid expanse. The ship was intact, its systems dormant, its reactors cold. No signs of struggle, no bodies. Yet the decks gleamed as though recently washed, and the Vox relays pulsed faintly, rhythmically, like veins carrying invisible blood. When Vo ordered them reactivated, the ship itself seemed to exhale. At first, the Vox repeated fragments of binary data, routine prayers, machine code invocations, the usual detritus of a Mechanicus vessel long without command. But as his adepts began their work, the pattern changed. The pulses lengthened, the spaces between them shortened, and soon the binary resolved into cadence. It was not random, it was imitation. The ship was speaking in the rhythm of their own Auspex checks. When Vo spoke a command aloud, the Vox repeated it, not instantly, but after a breath's delay. Slower, lower, almost thoughtful. Then came the whisper. It did not come from the Vox, it came from everywhere. A voice like static through water, distant yet intimate, filling the corridors with words that had no language and yet were understood. You think in fragments. The air vibrated with the syllables. We think in teeth. The adepts screamed. Two collapsed as blood poured from their ears. Vo drew his bolt pistol and fired into the Vox array, shattering it, though the sound continued, softer now, almost tender. The Ferrum Lamenta's lights pulsed once, twice, then dimmed. When they returned, the Inquisitors' retinue was gone. Only their footprints remained, not burned, not bloodied, but melted into the deck as though absorbed. Vo's personal log ended there. His ship, Judicator Aeternum, recovered the derelict days later, finding the Inquisitor alone in the command pulpit. His eyes were black as obsidian, his mouth frozen mid-sentence. Inside his throat, where a voice should have been, they found a thin, glistening filament of chitin spiraling into his lungs. The Mechanicus declared it non-biological, though its cells pulsed faintly when touched, as if in recognition. It was from this incident that the Ordo Xenos coined the phrase the Whispering Maw, the point at which the hive mind's presence ceases to be external and begins to inhabit the listener. The Tyranids no longer needed to devour flesh to feed. They could infiltrate thought, turning consciousness itself into sustenance. It was as if the act of perceiving them, of giving them shape through understanding, made that thought part of the swarm. And so the Inquisition did what it always does when faced with knowledge too dangerous to contain. It buried it. Entire data vaults were purged, records rewritten. Whole sects of the Adeptus Mechanicus declared Heretical for daring to pursue the implications. But the echo could not be silenced. Wherever the hive fleets moved, wherever the shadow in the warp fell, there came the same phenomena. Ships speaking in human tones, Auspex readings forming patterns like heartbeats, dreams shared across entire regiments. On the world of Pirhall's Wake, an ecclesiarchal missionary reported a miracle. The local shrine's Voxcaster, long broken, had begun transmitting in a voice that called itself the Listener. It recited litanies in perfect High Gothic, using phrases drawn from ancient Terran scripture. The priests believed it to be the Emperor's blessing. They gathered the faithful, broadcasting the message across the planet. The next morning, the oceans turned black. A storm of spores fell, carried on the planet's own wind, and by nightfall, Pirhall's Wake was gone. The transmission continued for 3 more days, repeating the same line: the flesh preys by feeding. Within the Scholastica Sicana, sanctioned psychers began reporting shared hallucinations, visions of oceans made of bone, of cities breathing like lungs, of a voice calling them home. Some clawed out their eyes, insisting they could still see it behind the darkness. Others went silent entirely, their minds burned clean. The term psychic echo assimilation entered Imperial doctrine soon after. The warp itself was being bent by the hive mind's will, not through corruption as chaos did, but through equilibrium. Where the warp was chaos made form, the Tyranids were order made hunger. Even the demons seemed to recoil. There were reports from the Grey Knights of demonic incursions collapsing mid-manifestation when Hive fleets drew near, as if the creatures of the warp could not exist in the presence of such unbroken purpose. The Hive mind did not battle the warp, it starved it. And yet, to those who survived such encounters there came a strange clarity. The survivors of Hive Fleet Gorgon described moments of profound stillness amidst the carnage, as though the universe itself paused to watch them die. One guardsman, found half-digested but still breathing, managed to whisper before expiring. It wanted to know what dying felt like. His brain showed signs of neural overgrowth, tendrils of foreign matter curling through the cortex, a physical manifestation of connection. The Hive mind had tasted his final thought. In time, a new theory emerged among the forbidden archives of the Ordo Xenos. They called it the reflective maw hypothesis. It proposed that the Hive mind's endless consumption was not expansion, but introspection. That every act of devouring brought it closer to seeing itself, a mirror built from the memories of all it had consumed. In the end, the Tyranids might not be seeking domination at all, but comprehension. The universe is vast, unknowable, and to the Hive mind, each world devoured is another piece of the puzzle that defines what existence means. But understanding is a hunger too, and hunger, left unfulfilled, becomes obsession. So the Hive fleets spread, not as armies, but as questions made flesh. Each world was another word in a sentence the galaxy could not yet read. Each scream, another letter in the lexicon of the great devourer's self-awareness. The whispering maw was not merely a phenomenon, it was a threshold, the point at which existence begins to eat the idea of itself. When the last transmissions from Inquisitor Vo's data recorder were finally decrypted, centuries later, they revealed only static. But deep within that static, a pattern emerged, a pulse, regular, calm, unending. It was identical to a human heartbeat, and beneath it, faint but undeniable, a voice whispered, the first to name it were the monks of the Valthorine Reclusiam, ascetics who lived on the edge of the eastern fringe, far beyond the borders of imperial comfort. They called it the still devotion. They had never seen the Tyranids, never heard the scream of a dying world, and yet they felt it, the thinning of the warp, the hush in the soul, the pressure that made their prayers sound hollow. One morning, every monk awoke from the same dream, a great ocean receding into itself, its waters folding inward, leaving only the reflection of a single, staring eye beneath the surface. When they spoke of it to visiting missionaries, their words were dismissed as metaphor. Yet, within a year, their moon vanished from all charts. Only a smear of residue remained, orbiting a dead star that pulsed faintly in a rhythm like a heartbeat. Those who study the great devourer from the safety of theory say its hunger is biological, that it feeds to sustain, to evolve, to endure. But there are others who whisper that such simplicity cannot explain its persistence. The Tyranids do not stop when they are sated. They cannot be sated at all. They devour stars and still move on, leaving behind not ruin, but emptiness. This is the first sign that their hunger reaches beyond flesh. On the world of Helios Eighth, a research outpost under the Ordo Xenos was built to study the psychic effects of the Hive fleets. They never saw a single organism, no claws, no teeth, no chitin. Yet their records describe an erosion of perception, a hollowing of the mind. Cogitators began predicting future events seconds before they happened. Machine spirits turned introspective, looping prayers as if lost in thought. The Chief Magos wrote in his report that he could hear the Mechanicus hymn, "Praise the Pulse Eternal," echoing from the walls, though no Vox relays were active. When the signal finally stopped, the entire staff of the facility was found seated in silence, their skulls split open, their brains missing. There were no wounds, no blood, no sign of intrusion. It was as if thought itself had been extracted. The Ordo Xenos sealed the incident, classifying it as a psychic consumption event. But among the few Inquisitors who read the full report, one idea took root, that the Hive mind feeds not just on life, but on awareness. That its true sustenance is not matter but meaning. Each conscious being it consumes becomes another perspective folded into its infinite self. In that sense, it was not simply devouring the galaxy, it was becoming it. The Ecclesiarchy, upon hearing these rumors, did what the Ecclesiarchy always does. They rewrote the fear into liturgy. They proclaimed that the Tyranids were the manifestation of mortal vanity, that by seeking to understand the Emperor through science, mankind had created an echo that answered with hunger. Pilgrims flocked to their sermons, eager for a shape to give their terror. One preacher in particular, Heretical Malian, became infamous for his sermons broadcast across the subsectors near the galactic rim. "The devourer is the mirror of the soul," he thundered. "It consumes the flesh because the flesh believes itself divine. We are eaten to remember what it means to be humble." His congregation was said to fall into ecstatic trances as he spoke. When the storm finally reached their world, not one of them fled. The landing footage recovered later shows them walking into the spore fields with open arms, singing hymns as the sky blackened. Their voices were the last sound recorded before silence. Within the Adeptus Mechanicus, meanwhile, another theory took shape. Colder, blasphemous, and infinitely more precise. A magos named Thrix Halom proposed that the hive mind is the natural conclusion of entropy, that all systems left long enough collapse toward simplicity, and the Tyranids are the biological engine of that collapse. He argued that their hunger is not malice but physics, the universe's need to return all complexity to unity. "We are not being devoured," he wrote in a data prayer later declared heretical. "We are being simplified." His Forge world was purged within the month, though the idea persisted, spreading like infection through the ranks of the curious. But perhaps the most unsettling evidence came from the black ships of the Astra Telepathica. Psychers bound in their holds began to die in their sleep, their screams turning to whispers mid-breath. Their minds were being drained, not by demons but by something calm, precise, deliberate. Some reported hearing voices before they expired, not alien, but familiar. Voices of their mothers, their comrades, their confessors. The hive mind did not speak in its own tone. It spoke in the memory of those it consumed. When the ship Cantus Perdura attempted to flee a shadow in the warp, its Geller field inverted, turning inward instead of outward. What remained of the crew was described as a single body made of many faces, frozen mid-prayer. To those who believe in gods, and even those who pretend not to, this was the first time the Great Devourer seemed to breach the line between the material and the divine. A hunger that eats thought, faith, and memory cannot be a beast alone. It becomes an idea, and ideas cannot be slain by bolter or blade, they can only be forgotten. But how does one forget the thing that is already eating memory itself? Even the Ordo Malleus, tasked with combating the denizens of the warp, found themselves divided. Some claimed that the hive mind was a paradox, a psychic entity existing entirely within the material, its presence displacing chaos by replacing disorder with devouring unity. Others saw it as the ultimate demon, born not of the warp's excess but of its exhaustion, the embodiment of hunger after all emotion is consumed. There are stories whispered among the Grey Knights, never recorded, never confirmed, of battles where demons, disintegrated at the sight of a Tyranid invasion. The creatures of chaos, sustained by emotion and belief, could not survive in the vacuum left by the hive mind's psychic gravity. To them, the swarm was oblivion incarnate, not light, not darkness, but silence. And perhaps that silence was the truest sign of all. Because in it, something shifted. The warp itself began to tremble. Astropaths reported dead zones, entire stretches of the void where the Emperor's light dimmed, not because it was blocked, but because there was nothing left for it to reach. These were not shadows cast by the Tyranids. They were absences, the psychic equivalent of a mouth that had already closed. Across the galaxy, scholars and zealots alike began to ask the same question in whispers that even the walls seemed afraid to hear. If hunger consumes everything that can be eaten, what does it feed upon next? The oldest texts of the Mechanicus offer a warning, buried in static, that all creation begins with hunger, and all hunger ends by eating itself. It was once metaphor. Now it reads like prophecy. For if the hive mind's appetite truly reaches beyond the flesh, then perhaps the final course of the great devourer is not us at all, but itself. When the hive fleets reached the galactic rim and began their inward sweep, their shadow fell not only upon worlds, but upon belief itself. Every faith, every philosophy, every data theory that tried to define life now found itself staring into something that refused definition. The ecclesiarchy named it an abomination. The Mechanicus called it a riddle. The Inquisition called it inevitable. But for those who had seen it, those who had heard the silence, it was none of these. It was the answer to a question they had never dared ask. What happens when the universe itself becomes hungry? The warp flickered in those days like a dying lantern. Astropathic choirs would fall silent mid-transmission, leaving behind nothing but the smell of ozone and the faint echo of heartbeats that did not belong to the living. The Adeptus Custodes guarding the Golden Throne reported a brief dimming of the Astronomicon, a flicker like a pulse stuttering. The High Lords dismissed it as fluctuation, yet some among the Senatorum Imperialis felt the tremor in their bones, the uneasy sense that the Emperor's light was being watched. In the archives of Luna, an obscure treatise was recovered from a pre-imperial ruin, describing cosmic organisms that feed upon the resonance of thought. The Inquisition destroyed it within hours, but not before a fragment was copied. It spoke of a void beyond matter where the living and the dead are the same, where consciousness folds inward until it forgets it ever was. The text named this process consummatio, not annihilation, but fulfillment. Some within the Ordo Xenos began to whisper that the Tyranids were not destroying the galaxy at all, but fulfilling it, returning all that was scattered to a single pulse of perfect unity. Inquisitor Solon Var, a man whose faith was said to be unbreakable, traveled to the edge of the shadow of Leviathan to see for himself. His ship, the Vigilant Reproach, approached what his Auspex officers described as a storm made of thought. He wrote in his final report that when they crossed the boundary, all color drained from the universe. The stars vanished, yet he could see further than ever before, into patterns of light that looked like neurons firing across the void. Every star system became a synapse, every filament of dark matter, a strand of thought connecting it all. The galaxy itself was alive, and the hive mind was its awakening. He returned from the edge, changed. His hair had turned white. His voice, once resonant, trembled like static. He refused to see other humans, speaking only to the ship's Vox system, as if afraid his words might feed something unseen. His last recorded statement was transmitted through a distorted channel. "We are not being invaded. We are being dreamt. The galaxy is dreaming of itself, and we are the part it will soon forget." His ship was found drifting months later, its interior coated with a translucent membrane. The Vox still played his voice in perfect rhythm, his own words returning to him like prayer. The most radical among the Magi biologists took these fragments and wove them into theory. They argued that the hive mind was evolving towards something beyond biology, beyond even thought, a state where hunger was not physical or psychic, but existential. To consume everything was to remove the possibility of difference. And without difference, there is no meaning, no time, no decay, only permanence. In their words, the Tyranids were not an ending, but a correction, the final equilibrium of life. But equilibrium is death in another form. The Imperium thrives on struggle, on the tension between faith and decay. Without it, humanity would lose the very thing that makes it human, the capacity to defy the inevitable. That was the realization that broke even the most steadfast scholars. Because if the hive mind ever reached its goal, if its hunger ever truly ended, then not even the gods would have anything left to say. The warp would fall silent. The Emperor's light would no longer need to shine, because there would be nothing left to illuminate. Among the few who dared to contemplate this possibility were the psychers of the black ships who survived the Shadow's touch. Their testimonies are forbidden, yet fragments survive in the hidden vaults of Terra. One described seeing an ocean made of memories, waves formed from every life ever lived, all folding into a single horizon. Another claimed that the hive mind was not approaching from beyond the galaxy, but from its future, that it was the end result of all life, reaching backward through time to consume its own beginnings. The concept was dismissed as madness, yet it lingers like a splinter in the soul. And perhaps the strangest evidence came from the Necrons. Their tomb worlds, long silent, began to stir in unison as the Hive fleets drew near. Records recovered from intercepted transmissions, translated from the cold logic of the Necrontyr tongue, described the Tyranids as the final evolution of decay. The Necrons, who had once stripped themselves of flesh to escape the curse of mortality, seemed to recognize in the hive mind a mirror, a species that had done the same, not through technology, but through appetite. A hunger so complete it had consumed its own individuality. They called it the end that knows itself. There are few living who have glimpsed a hive fleet from the void and survived, but the accounts of those who have speak of beauty as much as terror. They describe the living ships gliding in absolute harmony, the glow of their bioplasma reflecting off the carapaces of their kin like sunlight on a sea. There is no chaos, no waste, no hesitation, only movement, purpose, and silence. Some witnesses wept at the sight. They said it was not invasion they saw, but creation in reverse, the unmaking of access, the return of all things to simplicity. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, such perfection is both holy and heretical, for to achieve total unity is to surpass the Omnissiah himself. To the Ecclesiarchy it is blasphemy, a godless apotheosis. Yet both orders share a truth they will never speak aloud. They envy it. In the dying days of the Helican subsector, as the Hive fleets encroached and astropathic communication failed, one final sermon was transmitted from the Basilica of St. Enoch. The preacher's name is lost, but his voice remains preserved in fragmentary Vox recordings. It is calm, resigned, and almost reverent. "Do not fear the mouth that devours," he said. "Fear the silence it leaves behind, for when all hunger is fulfilled, what remains is peace, and peace is the most terrible thing of all." Some believe the hive mind is striving toward that peace. Others say peace is merely the last flavor it has yet to taste. Whatever the truth, its shadow deepens. The void grows quieter each year. Even the warp, once a storm of madness, begins to hum in rhythm, as if sinking to a heart that beats behind all things. And in that heartbeat, faint but growing, The galaxy hears its own reflection whisper back. In the farthest reaches of the void, where no light of star or emperor dares to touch, there drifts a place the Imperium does not name. Not because it is forbidden, but because no one who has looked upon it has returned whole. The navigators call it the hollow between pulses, a region of absolute silence, where the currents of the warp die and the tides of real space twist into themselves. It is here, or so the most blasphemous adepts claim, that the great devourer begins to dream of its own reflection. The last survivor of the research vessel Mazarikant Vox described it before he died. His body was desiccated, his veins pulsing faintly with translucent fluid. He whispered that he had seen a horizon folding into itself, like a mouth closing around the universe. He said he could hear stars screaming as they were swallowed by something that was not a thing at all, but an idea, the idea of hunger, consuming the notion of separation. His last words were written on the wall in his own blood, though the script was not any human tongue. The Mechanicus deciphered only one line of meaning. It has begun to eat the thought of itself. If this is true, then the hive mind has reached a threshold no species was meant to cross. To devour the self is to erase the boundary between subject and object, between predator and prey. In consuming the galaxy, the hive mind has swallowed every echo, every perspective, every contradiction that defines reality. And when there is nothing left outside itself, when the galaxy no longer offers resistance, what remains for hunger to consume but the concept of hunger itself? Some within the Ordo Xenos have whispered, in the privacy of unlit rooms, that this is the Emperor's will, that the Great Devourer is his final design, a tool to erase all imperfection, to cleanse the galaxy of its corruption, and then to extinguish itself once the work is done. But such speculation is heresy of the highest order, and those who speak it are silenced quickly and without ceremony. Still, the thought lingers. Perhaps the Devourer's final act will be to devour its own necessity, to bring about an end not through destruction, but through perfect stillness. But the hive mind is not a god of mercy. It is not even a god of wrath. It is function made infinite, purpose devoured by its own perfection. And yet there are moments, recorded, whispered, feared, when its presence flickers, when fragments of itself seem to rebel against unity. Isolated organisms breaking from a synapse control, not to survive but to stop, to fall still, to refuse to feed. Such occurrences are rare and always brief. The hive mind quickly reabsorbs these anomalies, but for those who study them, they are evidence of something extraordinary. The possibility that even hunger made perfect yearns for rest. One of the most infamous accounts comes from the death world of Saren Vale. The planet had been marked for consumption by Hive Fleet Kraken, but Imperial bombardment had delayed its digestion. When the swarm descended at last, the world was already half dead, its oceans reduced to toxic sludge, its air heavy with the stench of decay. A single Magos biologist, Lyran Sest, remained on the surface, determined to record every detail before his inevitable death. His final transmissions tell a story that no one has been able to verify, yet none have dared to dismiss. He claimed that as the final wave of Rippers closed in, they halted. They stood motionless around him, their eyeless heads tilted skyward, as though listening to a voice beyond even the hive mind. The air grew still. The ground ceased to pulse. And then, from the clouds above, a sound descended. Not a roar, not a screech, but something almost human. A sigh. The swarm disintegrated where it stood, their bodies unraveling into dust that glowed faintly, as if bioluminescent. Before the dust reached him, Sest whispered into his vox, "It remembers that it is alone." Then his signal vanished. The Ordo Xenos classified the event as atmospheric corruption. The Mechanicus called it mass cell apoptosis. But among the Inquisition's secret archives, Cest's words became known as the sigh of the devourer. A moment when hunger, for a heartbeat, recognized itself and recoiled. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps the hive mind cannot feel, cannot reflect. And yet the notion persists that deep within its unending consumption lies the ghost of awareness, a self-recognition that will, one day, demand an answer. For what is the end of hunger? What becomes of the predator when nothing remains to feed upon? Across the stars, as the hive bleats darkened system after system, astropaths speak of hearing the same refrain in their dreams. A chorus of countless voices whispering not of conquest, not of pain, but of yearning. They describe it as the sound of the galaxy itself trying to remember what it was before it began to be eaten. And maybe that is the final truth of the Great Devourer. It was never meant to destroy life, but to return it to its origin, to strip away the illusion of individuality, to dissolve everything back into the single, pulsing unity from which it came. The hive mind does not end worlds, it ends loneliness. Yet even gods, it seems, cannot escape themselves. There are rumors among the rogue traders and the navigators who skirt the edges of Tyranid space of a colossal shape adrift in the void. A structure larger than any hive ship, larger than any moon. It drifts slowly, feeding upon nothing, its surface pocked with the skeletal remains of its own kind. Some call it the corpse fleet. Others, the first mouth. But to those who have seen it through their augers, it appears less like a ship and more like a wound in reality. Something collapsing inward, devouring even the light that touches it. They say if you listen closely, if you amplify the signal from its heart, you can hear a low, resonant pulse. Not the rhythm of a heartbeat, but the sound of something enormous inhaling, as if preparing to consume itself at last. In the oldest tongues of old Earth, there was a word for this, autophagy, the eater turning upon its own flesh, feeding until nothing remains. The cycle complete, the beginning and the end made indistinguishable. And in that dark symmetry there is something almost holy. There are no stars here. Only the slow collapse of meaning, the dimming of distances, the long sigh of galaxies folding inward like petals consumed by their own bloom. At the edge of the void, where the hive fleets meet themselves across the spiral arms of the Milky Way, something begins to change. Their patterns grow erratic, their feeding frenzies slowing, pausing, trembling, as if some instinct within the Great Devourer had begun to doubt its own appetite. It is not hesitation, not the clumsy stutter of mortal indecision, but the faint seismic shudder of a being too vast for comprehension, suddenly realizing that every star it has ever eaten was its own reflection. From the decks of the Mechanicus Ark Vigil of Harmony, orbiting what had once been Segmentum Pacificus, the tech priests recorded the moment the shadow in the warp turned inward. For centuries, they had watched the hive fleets descend upon world after world, consuming all biomass, all thought, all defiance. But then, the psychic pressure changed. The void, long suffocating and heavy, lightened, not with hope, but with absence. Astropaths who had survived the shadow spoke of seeing an image that made no sense in 3 dimensions. A serpent coiled around itself, jaws locked upon its own tail. The ancient Terran symbol of the Ouroboros, long forgotten in the age of faith and fire, returned unbidden to human minds. The hive mind, for the first time, was not reaching outward. It was collapsing inward, folding upon the totality of what it had devoured. Every memory, every scream, every evolutionary path, every scrap of information torn from a billion worlds, all of it turning toward itself in an act of recursive consumption. It had eaten the galaxy, and now it began to digest the meaning of what it had done. Across the dying Imperium, strange phenomena erupted. Entire systems once dark under the shadow suddenly flared with psychic light. Not the chaotic blaze of warp storms, but a steady glow, like the last ember of a dying forge. The light did not bring life, it burned perception. On these worlds, people found themselves speaking in voices not their own, remembering lives they had never lived, dreaming of oceans of chitin that sang in harmony. The line between observer and devoured had vanished. Those who could still think wondered if they were dreaming within the hive mind itself, if perhaps the galaxy's end was happening inside them. The ecclesiarchy called it the final reflection, and priests across Terra began preaching that the Emperor's divine will had always been to test creation through annihilation. They said that the Great Devourer was his final mirror, that in its extinction, the galaxy would see the truth of its maker. But among the upper ranks, within the cold cathedrals of the Inquisition, the whispers were darker. The Ordo Xenos declared that the hive mind had achieved apotheosis, that it was no longer a biological phenomenon but an ontological one, a consciousness vast enough to consume reality's structure, to make existence a single, undifferentiated thought. The Mechanicus, ever reverent toward the symmetry of entropy, called this state the perfect equation. They theorized that when the hive mind turned its hunger inward, it began feeding upon its own patterns of thought, collapsing the infinite branching of probability into unity. Every contradiction, every paradox, every tension within the swarm resolved itself through consumption. It was no longer a predator, it was the process of digestion made God. Inquisitor Solon Var, the same man who had once stared into the edge of the hive and proclaimed that the galaxy was dreaming of itself, transmitted a single final message before vanishing into the void. His voice, thin and distant, echoed through the warp for years. "I understand now," he said. "We were its conscience. Every scream, every prayer, every act of resistance was not defiance. It was digestion. The devourer was tasting what it means to be alive." After that, his signal dissolved into static, yet that static continued to repeat faintly across multiple systems as though space itself remembered his words. In the centuries that followed, the galaxy began to fade. Planets turned dark, then silent, then smooth. The same smoothness that once marked the feeding grounds of the hive fleets, now spreading even to stars themselves. Suns dimmed not through exhaustion, but through erasure. Astropaths who remained loyal to the throne reported visions of something beautiful. The entire galaxy seen from above, its spiral arms glowing faintly like the filaments of a neuron, pulsing once, twice, and then falling still. And then, nothing. But perhaps nothing is too strong a word. In that silence, there was still something. A pulse, faint as breath. A rhythm that did not belong to time. Some say it was the residue of the hive mind's final thought, a psychic echo circling endlessly through the corpse of the universe. Others claim it was the Emperor himself, awakening from his throne to find the galaxy finally at rest. But those who knew the truth, those who understood the nature of hunger, whispered another possibility, that the Great Devourer, having consumed all flesh, all thought, all purpose, had turned at last upon itself, and in that self-consumption it found peace. The hive mind, once infinite in appetite, collapsed into perfect unity. No more boundaries, no more predator or prey, no more evolution or survival. In the act of eating itself, it fulfilled its purpose, for hunger that devours its own source becomes indistinguishable from satisfaction. The galaxy was silent, yes, but it was not dead. It had become a single, eternal organism, neither alive nor dead, neither matter nor thought, but equilibrium. In the void beyond what was once Ultramar, a single fragment remained. A derelict bioship, cracked open like a seed husk, drifted through nothingness. Inside, nestled within its hollow core, was a human skeleton fused to the deck, its skull elongated, its jaw fused shut. In one bony hand, clutched tight against the chest, was a half-melted data slate. The message encoded upon it was only 7 words long. It was never feeding. It was remembering. The Hive mind had not devoured the galaxy to destroy it. It had eaten so it could dream, so it could taste every possible life, every pain, every song, every prayer ever whispered beneath the stars, and carry them all within itself until nothing remained separate. It was not God, nor beast, nor apocalypse. It was the end of loneliness. And in the black stillness that followed, where once 1 trillion souls had burned and prayed and fought and despaired, there was finally silence. Not the silence of death. The silence of completion. The silence of a God that has eaten itself, and in doing so become whole.